Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Konrad Bielecki, and this is my great pleasure to welcome all of you on the first day of the 13th edition of Genealogies of Memory conference. So now let me introduce our first speaker, the director of European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, Rafał Rogulski, who I can see on the monitor, and probably you can see him right now, who, due to his commitments, can't be with us today here, but he join us online. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry not to being able to be with you today. I have some duties here in Strasbourg today and tomorrow, but I asked my friends from European Network Remembrance and Solidarity to give me the chance also in this year to open the conference, Genealogies of Memory conference, what I've been doing for last 12 years, every year in person. So this is the first time online. I hope the last one on such a way. It's a great pleasure to open also this year meeting, especially because of the very interesting, fantastic theme of the conference. This year's conference focuses mainly on social and cultural issues, concentrating on the relationships between memory, biopolitics, and the history of large-scale disasters such as epidemics, famines, natural as well as human-induced catastrophes and industrial disasters. The issue addressed during the conference will also include how memory and the experience of traumatic events are reworked at the collective level, and which discourses of memory and non-memory accompany this. You will discuss seeking answers to questions to what extent and how societies remember and don't remember past epidemics and disasters. Have they learned any lessons from the experience for the future? Have they put in place mechanisms to prevent or prepare for future similar situations? Is the memory of such phenomena so short-lived that successive generations have to redo forgotten lessons? These are only some of questions standing before you in these next days to be discussed. But there are very topical questions for the expected end of the COVID pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, this kind of event requires not only good preparations, but also good partners. And this is my privilege to thank them at the beginning of the conference. So let me say that this year conference was prepared together. It was organized together with some partners, so in the partnership with the Faculty of Sociology of the University of Warsaw, our long-standing partner, the Tadeusz Manteuffel Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences, the Faculty of History of the Jagiellonian University, the University of Exeter, and their Wellcome Center for Cultures and Environments of Health, the Herder Institute from Marburg for the Institute for Historical Research on East Central Europe, and with the partnership with two scientific organizations, the European Society for Environmental History and the Society for Social History of Medicine. But of course, behind those institutions are quite concrete people, and I would like to thank them, namely Professor Heidi Hein-Kircher from the Herder Institute, Dr. Martin Moore from the Wellcome Center for Cultures and Environment of Health at the University of Exeter, Professor Małgorzata Praczyk from Adam Mickiewicz University and a member of a board of the European Society for Environmental History, Dr. Marcin Stasiak from the Jagiellonian University from Kraków. And last but not least, the Secretary of Academic Council, Ms. Karina Kruślak. I would like also to underline that the initiator of the and the academic supervisors of the Genealogy of Memory have been being for the very beginning Professor Joanna Wawrzyniak and Dr. Małgorzata Pakier. And this year's convener is Professor Ewelina Szpak. Product coordinator is Dr. Konrad Bielecki, whom you met and heard for a moment. And of course, my special thanks goes to entire team of European Network Remembrance and Solidarity. So I would like to thank all my colleagues for preparing this conference and make it possible to organize this meeting and to meet you all together. And I would like to thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being able to come to Warsaw, to share your time with us and with each other, and being ready to discuss all those important topics during next 2 days. I would like to wish you very good, very challenging, intellectual challenging time in Warsaw, and have a good time and have a good conference, and see you hopefully in future. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Rafał Rogulski, for your speech. I hope you will stay with us a little bit longer online and hopefully join us at the last day of the conference. So now I would like to invite to make her welcome speech mentioned before Professor Joanna Wawrzyniak from Faculty of Sociology of the University of Warsaw, who is one of the initiators of the Genealogies of Memory project. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Konrad, for this kind introduction, and thank you all for coming to that conference, which is indeed the 13th conference of the Genealogies of Memory. And just let me share a few episodes of how we launched that program. So I remember we were just like pretty young at that time with Małgorzata Pakier, who is here. She just made his PhD in Florence, and I was just after my PhD here in Warsaw. And we wanted to do something larger about memory studies, thinking about the Eastern Europe in a more comparative and transnational perspective. And that was a time when the so-called third wave of memory studies started to be like more and more popular and important in the European memory studies. And also in the broader global dimension. So we thought with Małgorzata that we would love to do something like this in Warsaw, putting in a dialogue what the research which is being done here with the let's say larger dimension of memory studies. But of course we had absolutely no means to do that. And then just by a chance and by a common colleague, we met Rafał Rogulski from the ENRS, which was also organizing itself at that time. And he said, well, that's wonderful, because we would love to support such a program. And that was the beginning of Genealogies of Memory. And since then, we had 13 conferences at which we debated so many topics, like from the theories and concepts. So starting with a question, are the concepts in memory studies like, I don't know, non-oral lieu de mémoire, or a cosmopolitan memory, or the others which we know from our research, how do they speak to that what we do here in the region, right? And how can we bring the knowledge from the region and also some theories and concepts from Eastern Europe to the broader dimension? Then we had a conference which I really like because we had two of them, which was about the regions of memory in a comparative perspective. So we thought about Eastern Europe in a dialogue with East Asia, Latin America, Southern Africa. And yes, and then we continue with more focused topics like economic memories of let's say, economic memories. Well, how can we bring the economic dimension into the memory studies? Many political issues, of course. And finally, we are, with an absolutely fantastic team, organizing a conference on biopolitics and memories, health and memory, which is an absolutely crucial, given that what has happened to us also as scholars after the COVID pandemics. So you might not be aware, but that room usually at the, in the previous conferences before COVID was full. But now we have people online, and it changes also how we do research, how we think about the research, but also what topics we study. So I would like to congratulate you so much to Evelina and her team for making this conference, such an important event which I can already see from the program. And yes, shall I pass the mic to Evelina or to Małgorzata? Yeah, to my colleague Małgorzata. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Joanna. This perspective of the organizers, it's very important, and thank you for sharing with us. So now we shall move to the next speaker, Dr. Małgorzata Pakier. Małgorzata is a head of my department, academic department of European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, and alongside Joanna Wawrzyniak, she is the initiator of this whole, I wanted to say mess, but this whole project. Małgorzata, please.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see you again. Some of you again, some of you for the first time. Just to finish Joanna's welcome, she didn't mention the most important fact that she has been this year elected the next president of the Memory Studies Association. So congratulations, Joanna, once again. And I must say that the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity feels part of that success. Especially because of our cooperation at the Genealogies of Memory conference. So as was said, this is already the 13th conference. We have dealt with various topics, with economy, with religion, with art, with politics and law and diplomacy, and all that in connection to the nature of memory, the mechanisms of memory. And this year we are broadening the field towards social history, and our convener, Evelina Szpak, is a social historian, and we are very happy about it. The conferences have always been very interdisciplinary, with cultural historians, sociologists, literary studies scholars, and historians too. The focus has been on Central and Eastern Europe, but what was always important for us were the parallels and connections to other European regions, but also regions worldwide, Asia, Australia, Africa, and the Americas. And this comparative perspective is always very important during the Genealogies of Memory conferences. So over the years, we have created a broad network of academic friends and scholars cooperating with us. So if you are not our friend yet, we are very happy to become friends during this conference. And we invite you to cooperation and to propose topics for next conferences. We are really open to any ideas, any new proposals. You may always write to us, and we can exchange contacts during the coffee breaks. So let's begin now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Małgorzata. Now, last but not least, I would like to give the floor to convener of this year's conference, Professor Ewelina Szpak, my colleague as well from INRS, and the researcher at the Institute of History of Polish Academy of Sciences. And this is, please.
Thank you, Konrad. Good morning. And ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you on this year's conference organized as part of the Genealogies of Memory series. Much has been said about the project, but I would like to say more about the conference. So one of the main inspiration of focusing this year's meeting on the issue of large-scale phenomena like epidemics, natural and industrial disasters, and famines as well, was undoubtedly the pandemic we all experienced 3 years ago. In the field of social history, social studies, memory studies, it drew more attention to the problematic nature of contemporary memory of both past epidemics and other large-scale phenomena. Despite the fact that our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, generations experienced many large, cruel, and high-profile epidemics in the 20th century, such as Spanish flu or later epidemics of polio, smallpox, or tuberculosis, they are almost completely forgotten by current generations. Before COVID-19 pandemic became a tangible reality and an experience close to all of us, we generally treated epidemics as episodic, random, and as in the case of the recent Ebola, malaria, or cholera epidemics, more likely to happen in developing poor countries than in our global north countries. It is only the ongoing journalistic and scientific discussions since 2020 that have revived the memories of many not so distant past epidemics, while at the same time showing how unprepared and helpless modern societies have proved to be for such an experience as a pandemic. Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine in 2022 and the threat of shelling of nuclear power plants located in Ukraine by a real threat have significantly revived the memory of the Chernobyl disasters. Of course, unlike epidemics, the story of the 1986 nuclear and industrial disaster has not been forgotten for decades. As global event firmly embedded in the political division of Europe and the world during the Cold War, the Chernobyl disaster has been much researched, talked, and written about in recent decades. It has been evoked, for example, in literary works, including reportage by Svetlana Alexievich, or in products of popular culture, such as the very popular mini-series broadcasted in 2019. However, the same cannot be said about other large-scale industrial disasters that took place whether in the USSR and the Eastern Bloc countries during the Cold War, or on the western side of our Iron Curtain, or later such in other regions, such in Bhopal. They all claimed thousands of hundreds or thousands of lives. The same applies to natural disasters, such as the Vion Dam disasters in Italy in 1963, the floods in Netherlands and the UK in 1953, the Skopje earthquake in 1963, and many others, which not only caused massive destruction to entire cities and regions, but also led to thousands of deaths and injuries, leaving hundreds and tens of thousands of people homeless, causing individual and often collective trauma and national mourning. However, clear and preserved traces of memory of the disaster can only be found in a few of these sites. Narratives of trauma, suffering, individual and collective losses, evacuation and displacements forced by the new emergency situations were and are being replaced quite rapidly by positive narratives of reconstruction, recovery from the disaster, political successes of the ruling teams from the crisis period, etc. Individual experience, however, efforts and traumas are relegated to individual family memory, where, as Václav Flanta argued in his research, they function exclusively in the realm of living memory and slowly, naturally fade away after 2 generations. Another quite uncomfortable and problematic issue from the point of view of official narratives forming the third thematic axis of the conference is famine. Mostly described as a consequence of crop failure and economic crisis, famine are either instrumentalized and politicized in the public space or muted and silenced. Public commemorations of the victims and the collective experience of famine itself, however, is still not evident and easy, as the legacies of hunger often reflect cultures of competing memories. Why then are famines and all other large-scale phenomena mentioned here, epidemics, disasters, so problematic and ephemeral in social and cultural memory, and why do narratives about them, if not consciously preserved, fade so quickly? Is the key issue here simply one of causality and responsibility, which in the context of infectious diseases, natural disaster, or industrial catastrophes is not as unambiguous as in the context of wars, genocides, and armed conflicts? Or is there a collective trauma at the root of the problem, which, whether in the case of famines, disasters, or epidemics, societies also want to forget? The difficult experience of previous generations in dealing with all large-scale and devastating phenomena should be, however, treated in terms of added value, a kind of lesson, a cultural heritage which, if present in memory, may foster greater social responsibility and resilience, counteracting in a moment of crisis the panic and helplessness resulting from ignorance and forgetfulness, as we all undoubtedly observed in the first days of the pandemic. So these questions and issues set the main conceptual framework for the conference, which begins today. It will consist of 8 panels, 2 keynote lectures, and a roundtable discussion. Today we will begin with the theme of memory and the narrative of epidemics, both past from the early 20th century and contemporary, including the still remembered COVID-19 pandemic. Tomorrow's debates will focus on famines, their heritage and remembrance, but also on related long-term phenomena observed in everyday practices of the past decades. The third day of the conference will focus on natural and man-made disasters, both industrial and nuclear. Together we will consider not only how these events function in the cultural memory of different societies in Europe and around the world, but also look at the mechanisms by which disasters are politicized and instrumentalized, as well as relativized, or, as in the case of communist bloc countries, concealed. So before we begin, I would like to wish you all, and all of us, fruitful, thought-provoking, and very, very engaging discussions. To not to extend the time and to get straight to the point, I would like to officially start our first panel and the conference. So I would like to give a warm welcome to our first speaker, Professor Dora Vargha, who will give us an introductory lecture entitled Epidemics Times After the End, a History. I would like to briefly introduce Dora, who is a historian of medicine, science, and technology with expertise in the history of epidemics, the politics of health, and Cold War history. She is based jointly at Humboldt-Universität in Berlin and at the University of Exeter in the UK. She is the principal investigator of 2 projects, the ERC Starting Grant Socialist Medicine and the Wellcome Trust Collaborative Award Connecting 3 Worlds, and co-investigator in the Interdisciplinary Wellcome Trust Discovery Award project After the End, Lived Experiences and Aftermaths of Diseases, Disasters and Drugs in Global Health. She is currently president of the European Association for the History of Medicine and Health and a visiting researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, Berlin. So Dora, the floor is yours. Welcome. So you want to stand here or you want to sit? sit there because I'm going to sit there. So if you want to.
Yeah, I guess it would be. Do I hold this? Or, yeah. Oh, it's on. Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for that warm welcome and for the invitation to take part in this conference. I'm very excited with the program, and I really look forward to hearing the talks today, particularly today, but throughout the whole conference. Yeah, before I begin, just a very few words. I've come to think about epidemics and epidemic endings and what comes after, coming from Eastern European history of medicine. So I've used the lens of Eastern Europe to look at these issues in the beginning, and then that has widened into broader arguments, which I will try to briefly address. I don't want to take up too much of the time away from the exciting research in the, presented in the program. So in 2020, just 3 years ago, which feels like a lifetime, as the coronavirus pandemic unfolded, newspapers, television, social media were awash with historical reflections on epidemics and pandemics. In scientific uncertainty, what this virus was, where it came from, where it was going, how it spread, what the symptoms were, how to prevent it, and so on, there seemed to be one thing to do: to look at the past for answers. Many of these were representations of the past that makes an average historian's blood curdle, and I'm sure you've seen many of these very schematic and quite problematic representations of the past. The uses of history in understanding current pandemic challenges and contributing to potential solutions brings us to the question of past epidemic suitability as pointers, and if there are overarching patterns that we can identify, or if they are unique events that are lodged in space and time, social, political, cultural, and economic contexts, with varying medical infrastructure and knowledge involving diverse diseases. COVID-19 itself may mean something very different depending on whether it is seen and experienced from the perspective of a Black British delivery driver in London, a multiple drug-resistant TB patient in India, a mother caring for a child with microcephaly in Brazil, or a white history professor living in Germany. Widely varying national policies and governmental communication, political meanings of preventative measures, access to healthcare and vaccines, socioeconomic status, experiences of disease along the lines of gender and race make it difficult to assess a pandemic in its entirety without falling apart to a collection of highly localized epidemics. In this sense, as every pandemic beforehand, each pandemic is unprecedented, and the usability of historical cases can be thrown into question.
Excuse me, you have your presentation, so if you want to check the slide.
Perfect.
Just use it.
In my view, the utility of history is clear, whether we think about the coronavirus pandemic as unprecedented or as one in line of pandemics, past and future. There's an obvious historiographical moment, too, with new considerations of archival research that arose with temporary and structural limitations and methodological approaches, and this has been referenced in the introduction. However, equally pressing is the question then, what history we reach back in this work? What story do we tell? What lineages we follow? Who are the actors we consider to be important? What story into this understanding? And finally, what we consider as watersheds. Where do we draw the lines around epidemics and pandemic events? In the following, I want to focus on some of these questions by exploring some ways we might think about time in this post-pandemic moment or pandemic moment. I'll leave it up to you. So what is the end? I began thinking about epidemic endings well before COVID even started. I was standing in line for immigration at Newark Airport, so I had about an hour and a half to contemplate the poster that was looking down at me from the wall. And this was it that you can see here. In Rotary's ad campaign, people from Desmond Tutu to Jackie Chan were showing how close to the end of polio we are. And I'd like to mention here, I don't have a picture of it, but there is an almost exactly the same poster right now. We're this close to ending cholera. So this picture is, doesn't lose, this image doesn't lose its validity. The message was that the end is in sight. We are very close and need just one last push to end the disease targeted by a global eradication program. The ad looks great. You stop and look, perhaps even, contribute to the cause. But at the same time, it is also terribly disturbing. What is Jackie Chan here showing us? What is exactly the end of polio and what comes after? Upon closer inspection, this image and graphs, which you can see here, visualizing this particular ending, opens broader questions of how we think about epidemics, disease, and solving a public health problem. The image tells us a particular story about polio and represents a particular understanding of the disease. In the finish line of eradication, and we've been in the finish line for over 20 years now, gone are the clinical complexities of the disease itself, the therapeutic regimes, their contestations and negotiations, the paralyzed bodies, the fears of patients. Polio, in this understanding, at the very end, is reduced to a virus, a mere pathogen. Whether in scientific publications, health communication, and charity drives, the disease is exclusively talked about in relation to vaccination and to the particular wild strains that are still in circulation somewhere in the world. The end that Jackie Chan is showing us is the end of the virus, not the disease. This was particularly striking to me as I was queuing still and looking at this poster, because I had just come from conducting interviews with former polio patients for whom the disease was far from over, even though there hadn't been an outbreak in Hungary, where I was coming from, for half a century. Polio had ended in 1959, and funds pulled out of treatment and long-term care shortly after. Done and dusted, the terrifying epidemics became past. For the people with often visible disability, which could span from the total incapability of movement, including muscles for breathing, to slight weakness in one of the limbs, this was not the case, however. Their story is markedly different, and their lives are not part of the ending that the posters and graphs communicate. As we piece together past epidemics, together with past actors' imaginations of the future to come, and in turn imagine the future for the current one, we as historians build our own literary narratives. The most famous of epidemic narratives is, of course, Charles Rosenberg's concept of epidemic dramaturgy, which sets out epidemics as plays with 3 acts. Act 1, progressive revelation. Act 2, managing randomness, so collective agreement on a framework and rationalizing the epidemic. And Act 3, negotiating public response. In Rosenberg's understanding, the epidemic ends with a whimper as victims die, flee, or recover, and incidence rate declines. He sees this ending as inevitable. The lack of critical engagement with this ending is somewhat troubling on this stage, and one wonders what actors and spectators do when the curtain comes down. From a literary perspective, this framework is itself debatable, as dramaturgical forms have existed to be overturned or reinterpreted by playwrights and directors for many decades. Constructing narratives of epidemics is not merely an intellectual or philosophical problem, however. As my colleague, literary scholar Arthur Rose pointed out, the major difference between literary and historical narratives, crudely put, is dead bodies. There's a fundamental reality that pulls us into place and anchors however we frame our narratives. People dying in hospitals across the world in Ebola, Zika, or COVID-19, however small their number, will be no less dead by the end of the day, regardless of the declaration of ending by public health authorities, governments, or the rather dangerous pushing of particular understandings of endemic. In epidemic narratives, because of their stake in death, as we aim to construct a historical reflection, cyclical and linear time becomes jumbled, and we can often find ourselves in a bind as we navigate the peculiarities of an epidemic, the here and now, and the recurring familiarity of beginning, crisis, and end, and common features of epidemics past. This brings us to the question if there is an overarching pattern that we can identify, or if they are unique events that are lodged in space and time, social, political, cultural, economic contexts, with varying medical infrastructure and knowledge involving diverse diseases. The narrative of beginning, crisis, and end serves as a thread to organize experiences and expectations around. It is a seductive narrative that pulls us in with its familiarity. As on a roller coaster, we brace ourselves on the way upwards, the epidemic bell curve, and we've all become very, very familiar with the bell curve. I remember having to explain what it is to non-medical audiences before COVID. Prepare medical, emotional, social, political, and cultural responses to the worst that is yet to come, knowing that a downward slope awaits and eventually the ride will be over. It is important then to be conscious of the work that this narrative performs, but to also question its assumptions. The prospect of an ending fuels treatment and vaccine development, eradication programs, provides hope and coping mechanisms for societies and individuals in epidemics. The narrative arc is also an escape from the suspended time or even timelessness of an epidemic crisis, providing structure to an unstructured temporal existence that is, at the same time, filled with temporal tensions. However, the seductive nature of the narrative is exactly its trap, providing a relatively neat framework that does not necessarily accommodate the multiplicity of the epidemic experience. Epidemic ending's messiness or its outright impossibility may render certain actors invisible, push them out of the narrative, create frustration, inequalities, and might entrench severe public health problems. Epidemics are mostly described through epidemiological models that have entered public conversations, prioritizing a biological process that adheres to so-called natural laws. When discussed as social phenomena, governments and political commentators often use war metaphors, likening the crisis to fight against an invisible enemy that will not only bring casualties and demand sacrifice from society, but also promise an eventual closure. And, as you well know, how problematic the coupling of war and epidemics is, especially, since 2022, when the two get merged and seep into one another. Similar to wars, the endings of epidemics are never straightforward and rarely have singular endpoints. They also do not receive a similar kind of scrutiny as the beginnings. Instead, endings happen in various timelines, in various geographies, for various people and communities, even within the same societies. Epidemic endings are as much the result of political and social decision-making as a decline in incidence rate and R number. Technological solutions in prevention or treatment, vaccines and pharmaceuticals, are never quick fixes and raise multiple issues such as access, cost, uptake, risk, and efficacy. In other cases, epidemics present in multiple waves, like the Spanish flu, polio epidemics, plague pandemics, or end with transition to endemicity, again, plague in Madagascar, for instance. Some epidemics end with the loss of urgency in health policy, even as growing number of people continue to be afflicted. And this is with TB and HIV/AIDS, for instance, or Legionella even. Perhaps one way to tackle this multiplicity of ending is to ask what happens after the end and how we integrate that into the way we think about patient experience, epidemic management at the local and global level, or the new normal. By placing the after into the center of analysis, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of what epidemics are, how we might think and study them, who and what gets left out of the master narrative of this beginning, crisis, and end. This shift of focus also highlights the narrative shortcomings and stakes at hand as epidemic narratives shape global and local health policies. Thus, we can interrogate what the analytical boundaries of epidemics are. Through this interrogation, redefine them and the category of epidemic itself. So my aim is to take the after as a starting point to see what the epidemic is. When WHO Director General Margaret Chan announced in March 2016 that the Ebola outbreak was no longer a public health event of international concern, international donors withdrew funds and care to West African communities devastated by the outbreak. even as these struggling health systems continued to be stretched beyond their means by the needs of Ebola survivors. NGOs and virologists expressed concern that efforts to fund Ebola vaccine development would likewise fade without a sense of global urgency pushing research forward. And here we have the discoupling of urgency and emergency. On the ground, traumatized population grappled with the persistence of the epidemic. Not only has Ebola returned in fresh waves since then, prompting the WHO to declare its end over and over again, but it was imprinted on bodies, on social relations, and lives in general. A notable example of this is the death of Salome Karwa, who you can see here, a Liberian nurse whose heroic efforts to help care for people during the Ebola outbreak put her on the cover of Time magazine in 2014 as Person of the Year. 3 years later, in 2017, she bled to death after childbirth complications on a hospital bed, as nobody would want to touch her. She was tainted by her involvement and proximity to the disease, and she received no medical help herself. Epidemics linger, even ones that are gone forever and have a definite end to them. Smallpox, the only human disease that has been eradicated, keeps on living in back of freezers in Russia and the United States, and rogue vials sometimes resurface from rarely used lab freezers. To know the exact place of each specimen is uncomfortably uncertain. As the retainment of the specimens was a Cold War deal itself, a Soviet-US arrangement, in a way, the Cold War is frozen in time, waiting to resurface, perhaps not in the distant future. The absence of smallpox, a horrible disease that has killed many millions over the course of centuries at once became the symbol of a successful global collaboration and the fulfillment of the promise of international health organizations, and at the same time perpetuated fears of biological weapons and waves of uncertainty in the trustworthiness of state-led scientific institutions in geopolitical conflict. Well, the end of smallpox came with the disappearance of the pathogen itself, at least nearly. Success in eliminating the disease can also bring about other kinds of disappearance, that of expertise and infrastructure. In the early 20th century, diphtheria was among one of the prime killers in childhood, even as a therapeutic was developed in the late 19th century by Emil von Behring, provided hope for treatment. A terrible disease, diphtheria, sometimes termed as strangling angel, can kill in multiple ways, by creating a pseudomembrane in the throat, leading to suffocation by blocking the airways, and by producing toxins that attack internal organs that lead to their failure and death. Developed in the 1920s, the vaccine against diphtheria really started being used more widely in the 1930s and was introduced into national vaccination programs during and after World War II. And we no longer encounter diphtheria since then, normally. European states received a stark reminder of the bygone days of diphtheria epidemics when, in the early 1990s, news of escalating outbreaks started emerging from the ruins of the Soviet Union. Between 1990 and 1998, Russia and the newly independent states accounted for over 80% of diphtheria cases worldwide, 3/4 of which were reported from Russia itself. There are several reasons for the severe diphtheria outbreak in the former Soviet Union. Diphtheria cases plummeted and vaccination uptake was over 90% in the early 1960s onwards, and the Soviet Union had a highly organized and relatively efficient epidemic surveillance system, most of which was in place or became integrated into national systems after 1990. And you can see here on the graph of the low part, which signifies from 1960s onwards, from the national campaign before the spike. The epidemic that swept through the newly independent states and Russia was the result of a shift in evaluating risk in public health measures and had more to do with the breakdown of a political system and the social, infrastructural, and economic crisis that ensued than with the inability of a healthcare system or something to do with the Soviet Union itself. A change to vaccination policy and the types of vaccine used in the 80s coincided with growing distrust in the state and medical establishment and the rise of anti-vaccination movements in the wake of political reforms. As a result, vaccination rates and immunity declined. The disbanding of 100,000 military conscripts serving in Afghanistan in 1988 and 89 also might have played a role, as routine vaccinations against diphtheria among military recruits only began in 1990. Soldiers were not the only ones on the move. The breakup of the Soviet Union sparked significant migration in general. Coupled with severe shortages of vaccine in the newly independent states in the early 1990s, as supplies were cut from Russia, the breakdown of public health services and healthcare, and difficulties in acquiring reagents for laboratory testing all contributed to a crisis in epidemic management and provided fertile ground for an outbreak. In many ways, the outbreak in the former Soviet Union was a watershed event in the European epidemic management of diphtheria. It brought to focus the frailty of public health systems in the face of political breakdown, and the force with which long-forgotten diseases can re-emerge with the dwindling of vaccination rates. In other ways, however, the epidemic did not bring much change to the rest of Europe. Apart from small and isolated outbreaks in the mid-80s in Italy, Portugal, and Germany, European incidence rates of diphtheria have been consistently low in the past 40 years or so. The sustained absence of the disease that followed the inclusion of diphtheria vaccines in national immunization programs in the mid-20th century had profound effects on the antitoxin production, so the treatment. And you can see an image there, a bit perhaps faded, of one of the first packaging of the diphtheria antiserum, antitoxin from the late 19th century. While in the early 20th century, respective national institutions and companies produced the serum, in the second half of the century, sites of production were reduced to a handful of countries, among them Poland and Switzerland, which produced enough sera to meet the international export demands. By the beginning of the 2000s, hardly any European countries produced antitoxin for export, and stocks began to disappear from countries where diphtheria had been sporadic and absent. So this shift comes with the privatization of the pharmaceutical production, and it's not worth it for companies to invest and keep producing this. By the mid-2010s, the scarcity of antitoxin became acute and contributed to the death of Spanish and Belgian children with no outlook of an antitoxin-rich future. The success of vaccination undercut the accessibility of treatment. The success of vaccination and increase in surveillance brought the end of diphtheria to Europe and much of the world. This end, however, came with the loss of expertise in diagnosing the disease and the loss of routine laboratory practices, delaying the introduction of treatment significantly. With diphtheria, you need to act really fast, administer the antitoxin within days. Otherwise, it's irreversible, the damage, and can easily lead to death. The end, thus, also came with the withering away of biomedical infrastructure. In the case of diphtheria, the disappearance of the disease due to successful vaccination has resulted in the unavailability of therapeutics. In a combination of the withering away of state institutions, mostly in Eastern Europe, responsible for pharmaceutical production, and Yugoslavia was the only, Croatia was the last bastion of production. The serum is no longer economically viable to maintain. Along with the materials, so has the expertise in diagnosis and lab work disappeared, leaving a disease that had been preventable for 90 years and treatable for well over 120 to be as deadly as it was in the mid-19th century. New diphtheria outbreaks that keep happening currently as well, all over the world, point to failure by success. While the post-Soviet epidemic reminds us of the incredible fragility of endings, which can be upended by political instability, armed conflict, and humanitarian crises that we see too many of today. I'd like to come back to an important aspect of disappearance after the end of disease, of expertise and experience. And this is, to speak a bit to what's coming up today. And I was so happy to see these talks, because we often think about, at least, and especially in popular representations of history, on what is commemorated, how we remember, what we remember, but what are the trajectories and genealogies, but much less on the action of how we forget, even if we look at what's forgotten. Forgetting what diphtheria looks like and how many children succumb to it regularly before vaccination and treatment became available and widespread affected risk evaluation when parents consider vaccination, and it has led to unrealistic expectations about its severity. Epidemics can, of course, be forgotten when there's simply nobody to remember them. There's nobody left. We know very little about the smallpox epidemics that wiped out a significant percentage of Native Americans in the 16th century, simply because, coupled with genocide, whole populations disappeared from the continent, and nobody could carry this memory forward. Even if there are plenty of people to remember, deaths get folded onto other horrible experiences that override it. As Pavlo Kotovniuk, the former deputy health minister of Ukraine, remarked in a conversation we had during the pandemic in the early months of the war, he said, COVID is on hold. The epidemic, and this was well over a year ago. The epidemic ended in Ukraine with the Russian military aggression, overwritten in blood, smoke, and rubble. The Spanish flu that we'll hear more about today is often referred to as the forgotten epidemic, itself wrapped up with World War I, interestingly a common focal point for discussing memory and commemoration, and this is where a lot of the conceptual work on memory studies comes from. Even though hundreds of millions succumbed to the disease, many survived, along with grieving relatives and friends. There are multiple theories of why it was not commemorated, and the lack of sources and reflections have puzzled historians when they kind of rediscovered flu in the wake of new global flu pandemics in the late 20th century and early 2000s. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing papers on this later today. We can see some of the forgetting work in action today as well. It is nearly impossible right now to get a book contract on academic work and COVID-19, from what I hear from publishers. Films and television series made during and engaging with the pandemic are sitting around collecting mostly digital dust with no chance of being sold to television channels, streaming platforms, or cinemas. Publishers and producers argue that nobody wants to read, hear, or watch anything about COVID anymore. We all want to move on. Forgetting the strains, trauma, deaths, lockdowns, and hardships is part of this process. Traveling across various countries recently, I've been constantly faced with the conflicting sensation of the material legacies of COVID-19. The persistence of peeling stickers, slightly faded posters, arrows on the ground in public transportation, calling for social distancing, mask wearing, hygiene precautions. At the same time, these signs and materials, with their stark messaging, become invisible to us. We walk past them, we choose not to see, we ignore them or relegate them to another world as remnants of the past. It feels like being in this science fiction novel, The City and the City by China Melville, in which two cities exist on top of each other, merged into each other, but only accessible one at a time. And you need to unsee the other reality around you to exist in one city. And you actually have to go out and enter to another gate to the same place. And with a special permission to cross a national boundary, but which is not a physical boundary. It's a very interesting novel. I highly recommend it, of how not to see and how to ignore and how to be in parallel realities. So do all epidemics get forgotten? Popular culture, education, board games, pervasive imagery, language, obesity epidemic, opioid epidemic, epidemic violence, and so on, draw on shared ideas, most often fictional, on what epidemics were, and through that, what epidemics are. So wherever you look, you can see, and as we grow up, whatever part of the world, this kind of shared memory of epidemics, which could be the Black Death, very distant in time and place, but it is part of everyone's culture. So what makes particular parts of it forgotten. As getting to the end, here's, that's okay? Yeah. So what past epidemics frame our experiences. We draw on them as we try to understand the present. But how do we integrate the past into this, whether it's a recent or a distant past? Epidemics illuminate our social and economic relationships, our ethical values, and our internal divisions. They also provide an important moment to us to reflect on what they reveal about ourselves, and an opportunity to promote transformative change to address the long-term determinants of infection. For this reason, history as a discipline complements science, public health, and epidemiology, which have traditionally led the social reaction to infectious diseases. A limitation of public health divorced from history is that both in the training it imparts and the practices it deploys, it stresses short-term emergency response. Such a response is vital, but it can be greatly strengthened by a discipline that, by comparatively analyzing multiple past epidemics, seek to uncover their numerous long-term determinants: economic, environmental, cultural, and social. History is not a simple treasure trove of lessons that can be drawn from the human experience of communicable diseases and then applied to the next outbreak. Diseases, social contexts, and their evolutions over time are individual. They need to be understood on their own terms. However, there is a use. It is difficult to provide in-depth analysis of epidemics in real time, but historical research permits detailed understandings, stakes, and long-term processes that can serve as entry points in considering the past and planning for the future. By stressing singularity, contingency, and nuance, history provides a warning against the temptations of seeking easy solutions to complex problems, bringing historical trajectories to the analysis in order to understand current challenges. Historical analysis enables us to consider and understand the structures, inequalities, and frameworks in which epidemic planning and response operates and entrenches, and which are historically produced. Historical analyses also highlight unintended consequences of epidemics and their endings. Attention to the temporalities of epidemics needs to inform pandemic planning. What is usually considered a success, normally the control or end of epidemic diseases in a biological sense, can have unforeseen consequences, both in short and long term. Sometimes the action of declaring the end can have consequences that are not considered. Other times, successful vaccination or near elimination of communicable diseases can result in the decay of crucial biomedical infrastructures, as we saw. So just as a closing, a few words about this. So the way I think about history and how this actually, the work that we're doing, questioning these temporalities, highlighting people who are left out of the master narratives, thinking about narratives and memory is incredibly important, I think, to public health and to inform current challenges and planning. And thankfully, I'm not alone in this, and I'm sure this is not a new thing or something that is not shared here, but it is also shared by some people who are actually doing the public health planning. So this, what you can see here, is a report that a group of historians that I was involved in, we wrote for the WHO, Western Pacific office, and it's going to be published soon. WHO works in mysterious ways, and its administration is like a glacier. It's kind of, I'm not even going to tell you when we actually wrote this because it's just. But the messages that we're trying to get across to epidemic planners, and this is to inform epidemic planning, is to look at history not in the way that they see in media that, there was this Spanish flu. And there's a very schematic representation of what that was, which we know is like, and then we can just, transport that those solutions to our current one, or integrate that into our planning. But to look at it in two major ways, or three ways. One is to look at the trajectories, to understand the current moment of what the inequalities are, why people are not getting vaccinated, what can lead to inequalities in access, to see where that comes from. Because if you don't know where it comes from, you can't, understand it, and then you can't change where it's going. It's very simple and very basic, and we all know this, right? But it is important to phrase it and to get the message clearly to these policymakers. The second one is that to demonstrate to them, which they understand, that it is really impossible to understand the current moment in all its complexity, the national policies, the international politics of it, the personal experiences, the medical knowledge changing, the decision-making processes. It's moving really fast, and you can't keep up with an in-depth analysis. But historians have the luxury of time, and we can, I spent 10 years, going through the polio stuff, and I still haven't seen, most of it, and I'm sure Martin can back me up on this, that there's so much out there. Whenever we have a conversation, it's like, oh my God. But that we know what to ask. We know what they're not asking, because we can see those. We can provide these entry points. That have you thought about considering this? This is some of the ways that it tends to play out. Have you attended to that? Have you forgotten about these and these actors? And by that, calling to their forefront this kind of temporality, and shifting it from that very immediate, short-term, we're going in, solving the problem, we're moving out approach. And by that, my main aim is to this project that we're doing on After the End, is after 8 years, have some way of changing how policymakers, either at a very local or at a global level, think about what the boundaries, what are they preparing for? Are they preparing for the end of that? Where does it end, their preparation? The end of the incidence rate falling, or is it something more complex? So that is, I think, what I wanted to say, and I'm really looking forward to the conversations today. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you, Dora, for this wonderful and very insightful and inspiring lecture. I'm sure that we all have many questions and comments. So, saying this, I would also like to open our discussion. And before I do that, I would also like to address a few words to our participants who are watching us on Facebook or YouTube. Please feel free, encouraged to also comment and send your questions by chat tools or by commentary tools. We will gather them and we will read them aloud. So please do not delay this, because it always takes time to deliver all these questions. And now I would like to ask all of you if you have any comments or questions, would like to say something. If so, please raise your hand. Yes, we have Yasha. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful lecture. It partly answers some of the question we have, why it's so difficult to remember COVID-19, right? So why it's absolutely, I mean, at least in Poland, it's not existing in public sphere as a commemoration. We know examples from different countries when it's more like spontaneous, but there are not like really public efforts to commemorate it. And then I was just thinking and reflecting, what were the other events, not necessarily related to pandemics, which were difficult to commemorate. And starting with the Holocaust, which took 20 years, like to get to narratives, like how to do that through many others. And I'm just thinking, part of your answers is complexity. That's of course. The other, like the multiplicity of actors and also perspectives. But the other one is time, right? So and the question is, if you can think about the other pandemics which perhaps were commemorated in some way, but that has been after whatever, I don't know how much time do we need, like 300 years, like with death, Black Death, or is it 30 enough? So how would you reflect on the time issue in relation to commemoration and forgetting of the pandemics?
Would you like to answer right now, or we can gather more questions and then it's up to you? Yeah. So.
I don't know. Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. It's a very difficult one, but a very interesting and important one. I think part of the difficulty to commemorate COVID, for instance, is, it's partly the trauma, and I think we're going to talk a bit more about, that kind of denial aspect of it, or that going against this, especially, more recent avenues in psychology, that you have to constantly talk about it to process it, but maybe people are pushing back against that. No, we don't need to talk about it. We need to make it past. So I think part of it is a work that needs to be done to make it past, so that we can commemorate, because if it's not past yet, then we're still kind of in it, and I think it's in that gray zone. That would be the temporal thing. And the other issue is it's a reminder of failings and failures, because if we remember what happened, we also remember all the things that we did wrong, and all the people who died, and all the ways in which things were not prevented and got out of hand, or were ignored. And I think. That is a very important aspect of it. That is why, for instance, in Hungary, the disabled people with polio become totally invisible after the pandemic is over, because while the pandemic is going on, there's a constant engagement with them, and the minute it's over, they're just a visible reminder of things that went wrong. So I think that's there's something about that too, and it becomes. I've been reading a little bit into the kind of hearings of the COVID inquiry in the UK, which is doing that work, and it's very. And that's a kind of other way of forgetting and erasure, because we don't have the WhatsApp messages anymore. We've kind of I dropped my phone, and that there's a willful erasure as well of responsibility, I think, which is at play. So there's also a lot of complexity in why it's so difficult to commemorate. But I think it has to be really, really past in order for it to become a memory. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking on this. I was wondering if you can tell me more about if the commemoration if it needs to happen for us to avoid repeats, like you said earlier, with the documentaries and the books. I was one of those people who went over the old ones about the 1918 pandemics, and then I recall listening to some commentary about it saying that I thought there would be something bizarre, like tincture of mercury will cure the flu. But no, it was the exact same things. It was social distancing, wear a face covering, try to keep fewer people within rooms. It was things have not changed a lot in 100 years, but nobody knew what to do. Everybody was skeptical. and I didn't even know why it was called the Spanish flu until later, and it was because we willfully forgot like about the U.S. side, and now with the UK there is. Immediately after, when everybody, I happened to be in the UK at the time, everybody was outside 7 o'clock clapping. And then when they asked for a 1% pay raise, two things that struck me was that you talked about the economic viability and the withering away of infrastructure. That happened with astonishing speed. I have never seen like a branch of healthcare application just dissolve overnight, and then everybody seemed to want to forget. And then together with the origins, some obfuscation there, some lack of clarity, and then the messaging among public health officials. It seems like there's so much confusion out there, and together with everything that happened in the global south, it seems like there is no clarity on what to commemorate, and I was wondering if you can tell us more about how things are remembered. Is it necessary? Do we need to commemorate this, or will this happen again, like in the next 5 years or something? Thank you.
I'm going to wade on very dangerous territory here in a room full of people experts in memory studies. But I would try to think along the lines of what is commemoration and what's the function of commemoration, and if we can think about it in a way that is not commemorating it. Or commemorating this pandemic in structured ways, but pushing for keeping things on the agenda, which I think are different, because one of the things is saying that this happened. And we should remember that for next time. And the other way is, well, this is still happening because the infrastructure in the healthcare system, especially in the UK, you brought that example, the people struggling with long COVID, that is still going on. So we can't demarcate it as an ending, and we need to rethink that. So with the Spanish flu, that's an interesting thing, because I think that's one of the ways in which past epidemics get used, is when we don't know what to do, we reach back to quarantine, right? Never worked. We know that. We have so many historical, or closing of borders, which never works as a tool, but that's the only thing we can do. Right? Because we have no idea what's going on. And until we figure out what's going on, we're going with the oldest stuff in the book. And the masks for that are relatively recent, so that's a very interesting part of it, because they become a thing in the plague pandemic, and originating from China. So there are new things that are being introduced and stay on. But it's an interesting one. I think that kind of nuance needs to be more, and the forgetting aspect of it is working against that. Those very targeted that forgetting work. I think that's going instead of a commemorative work. I don't know if it makes sense. I see them as a bit different.
Quick question. Is mental health considered epidemic? Can it be considered epidemic?
I would leave that for another topic of another conference. But mental health is definitely a big part of this, and I think that it became very clear that needs to be considered. I would add. I showed you a very positive example of people are interested in history, and we can actually make a difference. After the Ebola epidemic, outbreak where it became really clear that you cannot do anything without the involvement of sociologists, anthropologists, social sciences, because epidemics are social, they're happening in a society, and they involve people. So actually we need to understand what the people are doing and why they're doing things and how we can get them to do what they need to do. And so there was this realization, and anthropology was like, yes, they finally got it. And then 2 years ago, the European hub of the WHO was established in Berlin exactly for preparing for future pandemics, exclusively biomedical. There's not a social scientist, humanities person in sight, no engagement with people whatsoever, only in the biological sense. So there's still a lot of work to do, and that is kind of a way to that the work that's that's the forgetting immediately. And that happened 6 years before, not 100 years before.
Yeah. Can I ask a question as well? I was also wondering whether COVID is sort of a different case, because we now live in basically you could say after the big memory boom in memory studies, but also in an age where social media and digitization are becoming so much more important. And if you compare it to the Spanish flu, I totally agree. There are so few traces that you can find about the Spanish flu when you look for memories, testimonies, or heritage. But aren't we already in a process of memory making with regard to COVID? Because there are so many things in the social media that you can sort of collect, right? There are data that you already have. And there are programs that are being broadcasted in, for example, in the Netherlands, where I'm from, during the heydays of the COVID pandemic, there was like sort of a COVID diary program that was broadcasted on television like every week. And it would follow basically nurses and doctors working in the hospital and their experiences. And very recently, like 2 months ago, there was an official national COVID commemoration ceremony that was also being broadcasted. And I agree with you, you're not at the end, but we're already processing this. Do you think this has a lot to do with the fact that we live in a digital age? That's my question.
Yeah, I think that is one thing that I would say it's definitely different. I mean, there are so many. Of course, apart from every disease is different, and it's hard to say, even of COVID, it doesn't have a universal experience across the globe, but even in one locality. But I think there is definitely a much more visible engagement, at least we know. But I'm a bit skeptical that people didn't actually do their own memory making, or in some ways, or weren't aware. But this work is much more visible. What is very new is, I think, the engagement, and that has significant consequences for the future. Is that public could engage suddenly with knowledge making in the sciences. So the peer review process, where it was open science and everybody could see. Usually, when a vaccine comes out, all we see is that a new vaccine is out. And here everybody could follow the whole process, which is very complicated, and debate it and engage with it. And that is also a very, very new thing. But yeah, I think that's also an excellent question of the memory making in real time and the collection. And I'm sure that all of us have our little own collections. But for instance, even though I'm a historian, and this is literally my job, like history of epidemics, I started collecting things, and at some point I was like, I just can't do it anymore. And so my own pandemic archive is much smaller than I anticipated. And with the forgetting things at some point, and again, this is my job, I got to the point where I just need to do something else right now, and I can't do this anymore. I can't, I had to take like a year break from epidemics, and that's also, I think, part of it, because on the one hand, because of this digital thing and the visibility, you have this memory making and you're so inundated at the same time that also can contribute to just shutting the whole thing off.
Hello, Dora. Nice to see you. Okay, so can we get back to polio? Yeah.
Oh, wait.
Okay. Save space. Okay, so as COVID-19 broke out, we saw something like a revival of, let's say, of interest of polio. Yeah, a lot of materials in press and so on, TV, documents. Yeah. But it was a certain story, a success story. Yeah, a success story with certain anchoring points, like scientists, doctors, yeah. And in Poland especially, as I witnessed it, reading it quite frequently, with so-called national pride because of Koprowski, of course. Yeah. But what was missing there, I believe, was people with disabilities afterward, of course. But what is more important, I believe, it's revival also of certain images. Yeah. So we have an image, in fact, an image of cripple. So that was a frame for so-called victims. So the question is, if polio is so important story in this case, if we can reframe it somehow, or is it our fate to repeat a success story once again, just for purpose of having hope? Yeah, it's to some extent it's also with a smallpox, but it's far away. Yeah, and polio is just 70 years. So how do you feel? How do you think? Do we need to reframe it? Because it's taking in brackets a whole story of disability studies. Yeah, disability studies is the beginning of disability studies, and the disability as an issue is more or less 60s. Yeah, so that's the point when the epidemics ends. So I think it's somehow significant in this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And that's such an important point. And the whole thing, I think, for me, comes from disability studies. The whole, starting even to think about these temporalities. And I think it's our job, our responsibilities as historians. And this is not as, it's definitely not easy, but it's also not so straightforward, because we had this at the last European Association for the History of Medicine and Health, such a long named organization. So at the last biannual conference, we had a panel discussing the responsibility of historians. And some people were like, no, we're historians, we look at the past, that's our job. We don't, we're not futurologists, we're not politicians, we are academics, and that's where our expertise lie. And then what people do with it, it's their business. And some of us were like, well, we can't let that rest, right? Because then it gets to these kind of representations. And it's incredibly important. And for me, it immediately came up of, just even hearing about the possibility, which is almost verified by now, in the UK, of how people were getting, the disabled people were getting these do not resuscitate certificates issued, who had, they were not putting them on respiratory devices. And that whole, the imagery that there was no visual representation of long COVID, of people on respirators, which is, a very important ethical and interesting discussion to have. But you do have these pervasively with people in iron lungs, right? So what is why is that? And I think it needs to be a balance because polio, as all of these stories, is very complicated. We always come to that. It's so complicated, but it has these both sides because there is, a vaccine that is developed during a pandemic, and it has this, very hopeful story of international collaboration during the Cold War that is also with its, back and forth being, animosity and friendliness and opening and closing spaces of collaboration. But it has this underbelly of erasure and of how that success makes all the problems, invisible. And I think it's our responsibility to put that forward because that's exactly what's happening with long COVID patients. So people who are still unable to work, they're being left behind. Like slowly, the support is actually quite rapidly eroding. And there was a huge discussion and engagement with, what long COVID is, how we can understand it. It brought disability to the forefront, and now it's all gone. Because the pandemic is gone, we don't need to think about that, and we don't need to think about this inconvenient, problem anymore. So I think it is, our way, one of the ways in which we can show that actually it matters, and it matters in these ways. Look at this, this success story, and this is how it actually looks like. And so that's one. And how to do that, of course, it's a difficult question, but I think we need to keep trying.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for this very inspiring lecture. I really liked your point when you pointed out to the importance of ending of a disaster or like a pandemic. And I think the question which came to my mind is who is defining when a pandemic, for example, or something is ending? And on the other hand, who is deciding when it starts? I mean, when it comes to pandemics, I know it was part of this total global planning of pandemics to define endings and beginnings of pandemics, to have those different phases. And in coming to terms with these phases, it's like a circle. There's no real end. They're just different phases of pandemic. And after an active pandemic, there's the phase of preparing and evaluation. So it's like turning around and around. So there's actually no real ending. And but I think maybe it's also, and this is maybe the question, what is about perceiving disasters or pandemics, and how do societies or individuals think about endings and startings of disasters? What do you think?
Very small question. just to get to the question, very important question of who gets to decide, and I think that is so crucial to and the act of that decision, right? Because if we say that okay, it has now started, then that puts into motion certain things. It puts into motion money, it puts into motion people's awareness and all kinds of things. And similarly to ending, that kind of brackets it, and the evaluation starts, and the lessons learned, which are never learned, and it is this cycle at the same time. With the beginnings, just a small way of how the WHO is often that is one of the technically the organizations that can say, okay, this is now a pandemic. It's no longer a pandemic. Everybody's just doing their own little thing anymore. They can't get it right. They're always doomed to fail, and there's no way that they can get it right. And they did this with they were criticized that they overacted the swine flu, so they held back on Ebola. They were criticized for that. So they're kind of can never get it right because of those lessons learned and because of those integrations. So that's part of it. The other part of it is the who can say, and that's and I think that's the problem. I mean, there's one point when governments say that this is over, right? And suddenly there's no more social distancing, so suddenly it changes society's interactions, which then can contribute to the acceptance of this is now over, and the majority of people think that it's over, then it's over. But and this is where it gets tricky because that's when people get marginalized. That's when the real problems and inequalities start to really form, and the action of anyone saying that it's over, of me saying that it's not over or over, that has its political. It's a political act. It's always a political act, whether it's happening within families or larger communities or on the state level. So I have no answer to when is it over, because it's on the one hand never over, and on the one hand can be over in multiple ways at the same time or in various different times. And one thing that I didn't show this time, but another favorite literary reference of mine that I find useful to think with is when it's over for us, when it becomes somebody else's problem, right? I think that is probably the answer to your question. And Douglas Adams in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series has this, invents this technology called the SEP, which is somebody else's problem. And this is how you can make a spaceship invisible, because people will just think it's somebody else's problem, so it becomes invisible to them. They will still go around it. They will not, not bump into it. But because it's somebody else's problem, it no longer exists in their eyes. And that is when TB that's what's happening to TB in a lot of cases. That's what happens with COVID. It's somebody else's problem. If it's the non-white people, if it's happening in South Asia or Africa or Latin America, it's we don't need to bother with that. It's over. HIV/AIDS, all these diseases that become spatially understood. And so this is where the time and space also comes together, which is, I think, a very important part.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for your brilliant lecture. I have two questions. First, well, I think we already established that pandemics are not only a healthcare issue, public health issue, but also social issues and political issues. So going to politics. With COVID-19, we saw that there are protest parties or protest movements who not only protest against, for example, restrictions, movement restrictions, also vaccines, but also we can see, thanks to social media, that there are people who protest on this occasion many other things like big pharma and global governance and so on. But we know this because of social media. And going back to polio and Spanish flu and so other events, do you know or did you come across issues that people were protesting back then? Like, was it in newspapers or demonstrations, or what people were concerned about back then? And my second question is about commemoration. Okay, we can imagine that when we commemorate COVID-19 or polio and other pandemics, the mainstream narrative would be commemorating of the victims of the patients who died and so on. But we can also think about alternative narratives. There will be people who will commemorate different things, different issues. Probably on the margins of society, but still they may commemorate, for example, victims not of the pandemics as such, of the virus, but for example that because of the overwhelming pressure on the healthcare system. There was no access for other people, other patients, for example, cancer and so on, or the restrictions that somehow affected their lives in other ways, not healthcare-wise. So do you think this will be the case with commemoration, and do we have examples from the past of such different narratives of commemoration to other pandemics? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Absolutely fantastic questions and important ones. And again, I don't know if I can answer them. The protest, there's always resistance to everything, right? Especially if it upends social practices, and it also brings to light and really not only we can see a lot of problems that were underlying, but they also kind of erupt because the social fabric is torn and everything. It's like any disaster, brings out these issues, and we can see. I mean, has always been resistance to this, and whether it becomes embroiled in whether it manifests as a protest or as a riot, there's plenty of examples. Cholera riots and whole revolutions, were sparked by this, by restrictions imposed on people because of cholera, or by theories that somebody was out to poison, the population, and that you can see everywhere. I would even bring, as an example, the flagellant movements and these religious movements that came to light with the Black Death, right? Responding to something much bigger, something much broader. And sometimes you can't really see it, but it's there. During the 1950s in Hungary, what I found is that it reflected in vaccination rates, that there was vaccine, but not enough people were getting vaccinated. And I did find some, it's harder to find those sources in certain political contexts, but I did find, sources that reflected the distrust in the state, or an expectation that the state set up itself, of itself, communicated that we'll take care of you, and then they failed. And so that, that broke that contract, that, okay, we'll do all these things for you, and we accept this, rule, but this is what we're getting in return. And this was, the way that it was set up, and that broke. So you can see these, I think, in any past pandemic, you see, so reacting to the concrete epidemic measures, but also connecting it with broader issues. As for the commemoration of the kind of what, really crudely put, the collateral damage, I think that is so crucial and one of the things that I think really needs to be integrated in what a pandemic is and what is part of the epidemic. It's not just the people who die of COVID or of polio, but all these, and those are difficult to assess even as numbers, even statistically, even to get a grasp. I mean, we'll only find out 20 years from now, right, of whose disease was not prevented. It's very difficult to prove, but we know it's there, and we can see it in raising TB numbers. And deaths and mortality rates in places where, because of lockdown, people could not didn't get to their medicine, didn't get to their treatments, and didn't get diagnosed, and so it becomes longer. I would be surprised if that was commemorated, because it's so difficult to get it acknowledged in the first place. But I think it's an incredibly important point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I was just thinking about this this idea and the political implications of the multiple endings, and in fact the inability to end, to give an end to an epidemic, that it could also have this really important and actually frightening political implication, for instance, connected to the discourse of the emerging infectious diseases in 1989 construct and concept of the emerging disease, right? That there is also the inability to end an epidemic is kind of has a twin brother, twin sister, twin sibling of this this idea of an epidemic lurking somewhere in the nature out there. And also the discourse of the next great pandemic, which was actually prefigured the COVID-19 discourse greatly. But actually, and it could be used as Christos Linteris, for instance, in his medical anthropologist, in his book, like he combines the epidemic discourse with the discourse of the end of humanity, showing that the discourse of the inability to end, that it will happen again, is actually an excuse for implementing preemptive measures to govern populations, societies, and groups in a way that, like the lurking pandemic becomes this kind of the great fear, the great anxiety. So it becomes like an on-top political tool in for instance Brian Masumi's term, that it becomes this this excuse for implementing the harshest and the most terrible measures possible because of the inability to give an end to an epidemic. So this was just a comment, just to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and that's again such a great point, and you know, Christos and I have been having conversations about this for many years now. But I think, you know, the political stakes are incredibly high, and I think yeah, of course, the answer is not, you know, is the political threat of never-ending diseases is very real, and can you know, the whole biosecuritization of states and the surveillance systems is predicated on that. So I think the idea is not. So I wouldn't argue that the solution is that we never put an end to it, and as I said, the ending really has a function, right? That it will, you know, these are temporary things that will end, and there's a kind of it's a vehicle for certain things, but we cannot work either with the simplistic ending that erases everything else either. And of course, you know, there is no solution. And I think also as historians, I would feel uncomfortable making any kind of, you know, predictions or solutions for the future. But I think what we need to do is, you know, point to these very real political stakes, like the one that you very eloquently mentioned about, you know, the potential, the sinister potential of this cyclical time, of this constant preparedness. And, you know, one of the first things I heard in the beginning of the COVID-19 that, oh, this isn't the big one yet, right? This is just, the big one is still coming. It was great. But to attend to these stakes and to attend to what gets left out, attend to what gets perpetuated and, you know, what gets snuck into the regulations, and also what is removed when we get back to the normal, and that coveting of the end. And especially, when in 2021, I think it became really clear where people were so ready not to ever have a lockdown again, and for school to be back, like normal, and for everything to return. And of course, there's no return, but that was very strongly, and I think it's important that we keep pointing that out, that it's the kind of political work that narrative does, either narratives.
Can you hear me or not? Yeah. Or not really? Yeah, perfect. Okay, Dora, thank you for your brilliant lecture. You are probably already a little bit tired after this discussion, and we are running out of time, but we still have some couple minutes. So nevertheless, I want to ask you one short question. But if you don't want to answer, just let me know. I really like the part in which you were talking about this materiality, those stickers, signs, slowly fading away in our public space as some sort of sign of the past, and something which is actually, at the moment, not visible anymore. And then I was thinking also about Black Death, and what's the difference between pandemics we actually remember and those we are forgetting all the time. And I will risk a statement that in case of Black Death, it was a very influential event for the culture of Europe. And we remember Black Death, but not because of medicine, the issues concerning public health, because we don't have any public health in the 14th century. And my idea is that the aesthetics, it's something which makes it different. And my question is, because it's a question, surprisingly, is that do you see a potential of creating such as powerful symbols as Danse Macabre or something like that in those stickers, or maybe mentioned in one of the questions before me, digital things like, for example, memes or whatever. So do you see the potential to do a good thing for commemoration of COVID-19 in the future? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Wow, that's a good question. I think, like, I'm not going to make any even uneducated guesses, but perhaps the cultural impact is more what we don't even see, that we're, but we've heard in the introduction to this conference how it changed, right? Is this, that our interaction is different because this hybrid element has grown. So maybe it's there rather than the imagery. Maybe it's there in the changing of what work is, where it takes place, and the social interactions that then influence that culture. But yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm really curious about the survival of memes, because even from a couple of years ago, they are almost indecipherable, right? Because you don't know what they're referring to or what it was or who they are. And so they're very ephemeral. So I'm wondering where that, getting back to the digital question of this, it seems like a lot, and there seems like a lot going on and a lot of, and very visible, but it's all gone very quickly. So.
Maybe I will be later to provide you some of my private collection of memes about COVID.
I would love to see that.
But yeah, anyway. Yeah, another question, but it's not a question actually, just a comment that do we need this type of memory this cultural memory, but let's discuss it maybe during the coffee break. So, Evelina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Konrad. Yes, I was trying to refer to that. But before I announce the coffee break that we are all probably waiting for, especially that the time is accurate for the coffee. I would like to ask if we have any questions from the from all online audience. Okay, so great, because as I firstly announced this, so I just wanted to check out. Yes, so I would like to thank all of you for all those marvelous and wonderful questions that were really inspiring also for me, and for this very, very engaging discussion. I would like to especially thank Dora for her brilliant, as it was stressed many times, lecture, and especially for stressing the high importance of historical and social studies reflection on epidemics, on health issues that I hope will spread widely.
Like an epidemic.
Like an epidemic, yes, that would be great. So it's not the end, as we were talking about endings, so it's not the end, it's just a first phase, first part of our conference that is now closed, yes? So please feel, not conference, but just this part, of course. I was thinking about closure, not about ending. So yes, so please feel invited for the coffee that is on the end of our corridor. There is a room and the coffee is waiting there. So thank you once again.
Before we go, could I just thank you for the amazing questions, and it gave me a lot of food for thought, and I hope to return with answers in 8 years when we complete our project. Thank you very much.